wonderful, wonderful wife for Martin Luther. She gave him a good looking after. She proved a very admirable wife and a good businesswoman. Luther's home meant a great deal to him, and it was sort of the idea that domestic life was very, very important to the Lord and to Martin Luther. And so Luther's marriage to Catherine von Bora was very important, and she had a huge influence on his subsequent life. He called her My Katie, and she herself was a real sort of firebrand. There's a famous story of one time Luther was all depressed, and he was given to these fits of occasional depression sometimes. He was very melancholy, believing his work was all in vain and such. And so he's just moping around the house for several days, feeling very, very discouraged. And as the story goes, to sort of challenge this, his wife comes down, Catherine von Bora, she comes down dressed totally in black, as if she's in mourning for the dead. And she comes down, and Luther takes a look and he goes, "What are you doing?" And she goes, "Well, I'm in mourning. Somebody's died." And he goes, "Don't be foolish, woman. Who's died? What are you talking about?" And she says, "Well, I thought surely God must be dead, the way that you're moping around as a depressed man." And Luther had to laugh at that, and it just shook him out of his depression, showing him how foolish it was. Well, 1525 was more than just the year that Martin Luther married this remarkable woman who proved to be such a wonderful wife for him. It was also the year of the Peasants' War. And we don't have time to go into many details about the Peasants' War, but nearly 100,000 peasants were killed in this uprising against the German nobility. You see, you have to understand that Martin Luther set in motion forces that he wanted to control, but he could not control. He could not control the more radical reformers. And he could not control the way that his message resounded in the ears of the common people of Germany. Because many of the common people of Germany, many of the serfs, they were virtually slaves under their landowners. Very, very ill-treated. And when these common people heard that maybe the Pope didn't have the same authority over them that they had once heard that he really had, it wasn't a big step at all for them to say, well, maybe my Lord shouldn't have the same authority over me that once I thought he should have. And these ideas, owing to the initiative and the freedom of the individual, sparked, again, fed by some very fiery preachers, fed the whole Peasants' War. And as I said, nearly 100,000 peasants died, and many Protestant ministers were hanged by Catholic princes. Worst of all, the peasants believed that they were betrayed by Luther in this cause. That's how they felt. They felt, Luther, you started this whole thing. Because when the whole Peasants' War began, Luther spoke out against the peasants. He said, you have no place in taking up arms to defend your cause. You should not be doing this at all. The peasants felt betrayed. Actually, in one respect, you can say that Luther was right? He had no interest in fomenting a political revolution that would sweep all over Germany. But here's the other thing. And I think this made Luther somewhat boxed in. Do you remember the image that we looked at before of Frederick the Wise there, with his hands on his sword, protecting Luther? If Luther became a preacher of political and economic revolution, how long do you think someone like Frederick the Wise would protect him? Not very long, right? Luther instinctively understood that if he got behind these popular revolutions, there would be a sense in which he would be ending his own support that he needed so badly. Well, as time went on, there were different approaches that tried to be made between the Roman Catholics and the Lutherans. There was a final meeting at Augsburg in 1530, which was actually the last attempt to patch things up between the Lutherans and the Roman Catholics. Luther could not attend the meetings because it was too dangerous for him, but his colleague Philip Melanchthon presented the Lutheran views as non-offensively as he possibly could, but it didn't work. The Roman Catholic Council still demanded concessions that Luther and Melanchthon would not make, and the division became final. 1530, you could say, there was no turning back. But between 1517 and 1530, many people thought that maybe they could reconcile, maybe they could come back together, but not after 1530. Sadly, the end of Luther's life was not very encouraging. He saw a lot of things that made him discouraged and depressed. He saw the papacy gaining strength again after the preparations for the Council of Trent. He saw the growing menace of Catholic military might. He wrote some things at the end of his life that I wonder if Luther in heaven now doesn't greatly regret. He wrote things like, against the Anabaptists, against the Jews, against the papacy of Rome, founded by the devil. And many of these were violent, coarse, and angry tracts. In particular, his controversial writings against the Jews at the end of his life were a total contradiction of his earlier graciousness towards them. It may have been, and I would have to say this is just my opinion, but it may be that his seemingly irrational and wild anger against the Jews was caused by some form of dementia in his last years. In his last years, Luther was often ill and depressed. This may be medical, but it was also spiritual, because Luther was discouraged that his work had not had a greater impact on the daily life and morals of the common people. In many ways, he had launched an important and necessary theological reformation, but not a revival. That revival would come later, based, of course, on his work. His health was particularly bad at the end. He got very discouraged at different times. But yet early in the year 1546, Luther was asked to go to Eisleben, the place where he was born, to mediate in a quarrel between two arrogant young princes, Count Albrecht and Gebhard of Mansfeld. He was old and ill, but he still had a lot of authority, and basically he brought these two warring princes together in a wonderful sense of Christian reconciliation. But you see, the chill of death came upon him while he was on this journey, and he died at Eisleben, the same city where he was born, on February 18th. A remarkable life. Now, let me just conclude with a few final points about Luther. First of all, the Luther House in Wittenberg is an outstanding place to visit. If you ever have the occasion to go there and do a tour of the Luther House, it is well worth it. It is a fantastic museum. Secondly, we should also remember that Luther was a very accomplished musician who wrote many great hymns of the faith and who really valued music. He regarded music as the second most important discipline as compared to theology. He, of course, wrote his famous hymn, Ein feste Burg ist unser Gott. That idea, a mighty fortress is our God, among many other songs as well. At the root of it all, we should remember that Martin Luther was a man who was profoundly converted by the Spirit of God. As Luther said, "Did God call me on account of my holy life, or on account of my Pharisaical religion, or account of my prayers, fastings, and works? Never. Well then, it is certain that God did not call me on account of my blasphemies, persecutions, and oppressions. What prompted him to call me? His grace alone." Yeah, that's what Luther was at his root. He was a man profoundly changed by the gospel of Jesus Christ. And this carried out into everything in his life. At the same time, we can sympathize with those in Luther's day who wanted to take his great work even further and wanted to truly apply biblical principles to everything, including infant baptism, including the relationship between church and state, including the organization of the church itself, including the Mass, including the veneration of images and such as this. You see, in some ways, we would say that Luther, what he did is priceless. The church owes a tremendous debt to Martin Luther. As I said in our previous lecture, I can argue to you that he's the most influential man of the last millennium, of the last 1,000 years. But nevertheless, I think that we would have to say, with the beautiful hindsight of history, that Luther should have gone further. As Charles Spurgeon said, what a blessing it would have been in Luther's time if the Reformation had been carried out completely. Great as the work was, it was, in some points, a very superficial thing and left deadly errors untouched. Now, many of the people who wanted to touch those deadly errors were sort of crazy in themselves, but yet I think all in all, while not meaning to offend the memory of Martin Luther, we would say he could have gone even farther in what he did.